Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for that generous introduction. And thank you for having me here. I'm sorry I came a bit late. I managed to mislead everybody. My friends who collected me from the hotel, I told them I used to be a Beltway bandit in the late 90s, so I know DC like the back of my hand. And I managed to lose everyone. So I'm sorry for that. Today is 5th of February, and this day and this date is very important in the history of Tanzania. And it is not just because 52 years ago on this date, the then president, the first president of Tanzania, Mwalimu Nyerere, inaugurated the famous Arusha Declaration, the socialist blueprint for Tanzania, which by the early 1980s had spectacularly failed. And the date is important not because of that. It is important because in today's Tanzania, we are seeing the kind of policies that remind us of the economic folly that befell Tanzania after 1967. We are seeing the kind of command and control economic policies which led Tanzania to near disaster, near bankruptcy by the early 1980s, and which after 1985 were jettisoned, and it was good riddance for the country. But 5th of February is also important because it is the date which 40 years ago, it was 42 years ago? 42 years ago, yes. The nationalist movement for Tanganyika, TANU, which led Tanganyika to independence in 1961, and the Afro-Shirazi Party, which led the Zanzibar Revolution in 1964, merged to form the ruling party which has been in power all these years, Chama cha Mapinduzi. So 5th of February is very important because of these historical facts. But more than that, 5th of February is very important because on this date 3 years ago, on February 5th, 2016, on the 39th anniversary of CCM, President Magufuli, who had just been sworn in as president, he had been sworn in 3 months as president, declared in a televised speech that he would see to it that by 2020, by the year 2020, there will be no political opposition in Tanzania. A nationally televised address that he would want to see Tanzania essentially return to the dark days of one-party rule. I am here today with all that has happened to me personally and all that has happened to Tanzania since that day because of President Magufuli's pledge of turning Tanzania back to where it was prior to 1992. We went multi-party in 1992. So in these 3 years since President Magufuli made that pledge, we have seen the kind of politics that are unprecedented in our entire history. For almost a quarter century of our, during the first quarter century of our independence, up to at least 1992, we were a single-party state. We didn't have a Bill of Rights. We didn't have independent courts. There was no free press. Actually, the only press there was was you had only one newspaper owned by the government, Daily News. Other people call it the Daily Noise. And one newspaper owned by the ruling party, Uhuru. So there was no press to speak about, let alone independent press. So we had no Bill of Rights. We had no independent press. There were no political parties because the Constitution declared the country a one-party state. And for all intents and purposes, the sole ruling party determined whether you went to school or you didn't, whether you went to hospital or you didn't, whether you got a job or you didn't. The party was in total control. Now, since 1992, we have had a multi-party state. We have seen democratic space expand. Slowly for some of us. Very, very slowly for some of us. In fits and starts. For those of us who are too impatient. But there is no doubt that the democratic space was expanding. We got a Bill of Rights. We got a multi-party parliament in spite of the long shadow of imperial presidency that has always been a characteristic feature of our constitutional order. And you can see during this period an opposition, a political opposition, becoming better organized and doing better and better during elections. So that by 2015, President Magufuli, these are official figures, he got 58% of the total presidential vote. And the opposition candidate, the joint opposition candidate, Edward Lowassa, had 41%. This is unprecedented in our politics. But immediately after President Magufuli was sworn in, as I said, he declared war on democracy. And 3 years later, we share a record of disappearances and abduction of critics and dissidents, which was common in all sorts of obnoxious dictatorships of the 60s and 70s and 80s. Now, even though the Constitution declares the country a multi-party state, even though we have a Bill of Rights, today, for all practical purposes, Tanzania, there is a prohibition on politics declared by the president himself. Don't mind about the law. Don't mind what the law might say. For all intents and purposes, for the past 3 years, there's been a total prohibition of opposition politics. You cannot hold public meetings and rallies. In fact, it has become increasingly difficult even to hold internal party meetings. So at one point, our central committee was raided by the police. They don't have powers to regulate internal party meetings, but that has not stopped them from interfering with our meetings. Hundreds of our party leaders, members, activists are either in jail, or they're being prosecuted through the courts, or they have already served their time. That would be easy. But as I said earlier, we have also begun to see the kind of abductions and disappearances with all the hallmarks of official death squads in Tanzania. Today, it's almost 2.5 years since the personal assistant to my party chairman, the national chairman of my party and the leader of the official opposition in prison, went missing after spending months criticizing academic credentials of President Magufuli. President Magufuli is bandied about as the smartest leader in the continent. Never mind the fact that he cannot string a single sentence in straight English. But this gentleman questioned his academic qualifications and was snatched, and we have not seen him since. It's almost 2 years today since a journalist who was investigating the killings of hundreds of civilians just south of Dar es Salaam, which was carried out by the security forces, was snatched from his house in broad daylight. He's not been seen since. It's 3 years since a regional leader who comes from the same region as President Magufuli was murdered in broad daylight, hacked by machetes in broad daylight, and thrown by the roadside to bleed to death, and they took pictures and posted them on social media. No arrest, no investigation, not even a suspect. We speak today. The leader of the largest political party in opposition in the country and the official leader of opposition in parliament, Mr. Mbowe, my chairman, is in prison. Why? Because he got charged with sedition, with one of these, their favorite weapons. And he missed a court appearance when he came to Belgium to check me up. He hadn't seen me since last year, and when he went back, his bail was waived and he's inside 2 months now. And not just Mr. Mbowe, dozens of members of parliament from the opposition, mainly from my party, are facing criminal prosecution, and the standard offense is sedition. Now, our law defines sedition as making or publishing any statement that makes the government look bad. Now, in a multi-party state, in a multi-party democracy, how do you get rid of a government you don't like if you don't paint it black? If you don't show that this government is unfit to rule? Now, that is a criminal offense in Tanzania. I would say it is not entirely Magufuli's fault in this particular case, because our sedition provisions come from the 1950s, from 1953 actually, a year before the nationalist movement was born. It was enacted by the British to deal with the nationalist movement. But Nyerere used it, Mwinyi used it, and Magufuli is using it very, very liberally. 3 years since Magufuli made that pledge, hundreds of bloggers have either been tortured. I'm in my spare time, I'm a defense attorney. And I've spent months or years defending bloggers, young men who send these, innocuous messages on WhatsApp or, Instagram or whatever. And they've been tortured. We now have torture chambers. And many have gone to jail. So, and we've not spoken of my numerous cases and what happened to me on September 7, 2017. Anyway, to cut the long story short, the president's pledge to see Tanzania returning to one-party state by 2020 has been very costly. It has been 3 years of blood, toil, and tears. It has been 3 years of hope as well. I survived. And I think we will survive the Magufuli dictatorship. And one reason why we will survive the Magufuli dictatorship is he's a past genius in the art of making enemies. So he's made enemies all over. He provides us with the kind of opportunity to mobilize the nation the way it has never been mobilized before. So thank you for having me here. Thank you for listening to me. And I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and you can tell that you have that you're a lawyer by practice. You could serve as a professor as well, I'm sure. Listen, that's a very bleak picture that you paint. I wonder, and you pin much of this to the president himself. I wonder if you can say maybe why at this moment is President Magufuli a product of something bigger? In terms of the ruling party's maybe sense of fragility as the opposition grows. Why now has this, is it all just about the personality? And two, how much of the ruling party is it just a complacency? Are there skeptics within the party? Or is this something that is kind of a function of the party versus the individual?
But those are very good questions. I think it will not be entirely correct to pin everything in the person of John Pombe Magufuli. It will not be entirely correct. In 1952, barely a year after independence, we did away with the Westminster Constitution that was given to us by the British, which had created the constitutional framework for a liberal state. And we replaced it with the Republican Constitution that created what constitutional scholars have described as an imperial presidency. In short, our president is an emperor, an almost absolute monarch of the type that was common during the 18th, 19th century Europe, 18th century basically. So the president is so powerful. His shadow is everywhere, not just in the executive, but also in the judiciary, as well as in parliament. And these powers are largely unchecked. Even after we went multi-party state in 1992, and we got presidential term limits for the first time in 1985, the presidential powers under our constitution and laws are still very vast. Mwalimu Nyerere, the founder president, said in 1967 and in 1978 in an interview with the BBC that he had powers under the constitution to become a dictator. So the powers that Magufuli enjoys today are essentially the powers that Kikwete enjoyed, Mkapa enjoyed, and all our previous presidents to Mwalimu Nyerere enjoyed. The only difference is this, that Mwalimu Nyerere was always very aware of the dangers of those unlimited powers. And he said it openly. He always worried publicly about the dangers of these unchecked imperial power. President Magufuli, it's difficult to say that he really knows the extent of the powers under the Constitution, because he seems to believe that whatever he says, whatever comes out of his mouth, is the law of the land. Be it in the Constitution or not, but whatever he says is the law. But it is important to state the fact that the constitutional powers that he enjoys are what his predecessors had. The very strong personal element is in the sense that he relishes this arbitrary exercise of that power. He enjoys, you know, the kind of things that we've seen. Only last month, he declared again on television that he wouldn't want to see a member of the security forces who kills a civilian taken to court or lose their job. Now, this is a presidential license to kill in a country that has seen hundreds of civilians killed by the security forces. And here is the president talking live on TV saying he doesn't want to see any of his security apparatus, members of his security apparatus, taken to task for killing civilians. So he enjoys, it is part of his persona. So there is a personal element and this, the constitutional order that we inherited from back in 1962. On the question of whatever happened with CCM, his party, CCM is not a political party in the true sense of a political party, a party that derives its legitimacy from civil society. These people have always been in power. There has been a very close, almost indistinguishable interlinkages between CCM, the party, and the state. The president has always been the chairman of CCM. He's also the commander-in-chief, obviously. You see a revolving door between CCM and the civilian administration and the armed forces throughout our history. Not just during the period of one-party rule, when everybody, including myself, we were compelled to be CCM members. If you wanted to go to university, the first thing you showed was not your academic testimonials, the first thing you showed was your CCM membership card. Now, even during the era of multi-party politics, you still see this revolving door between the ruling party and the state and the army. It's the current publicity secretary, I think, or the director of foreign affairs is an army general. He was a member of the armed forces 2-3 years ago, and today he's, when our constitution prohibits members of the armed forces from being members of political parties. So CCM is not a political party that we understand all other political parties. This is a state party. And its power has always been derived not from the citizenry, but from the state. When they need money, they don't go to their members, they go to the president. And that's why you see we have these never-ending scandals every other election time of government officials plundering the treasury, largely in order to fund their election campaigns. So it is, you cannot think a party, that kind of a party will be able to control someone like Magufuli, because they depend on him entirely. And before Kikwete left office, he said at one of his meetings, you know, CCM should learn to deal with the opposition politically instead of relying on the police force. Because instead of dealing with the opposition in political terms, they have always relied on the violence of the state. Yeah.
What then, and I'm going to open it up for questions because I'm guessing there will be quite a few. What then do you see as kind of the opening? I mean, Magufuli, from reports, and maybe you differ, still enjoys a lot of popularity and kind of this populist move, and we've seen this elsewhere, kind of a populist who is willing to kind of trample democratic norms and process, but still retains a great deal of a strong base within the population. And I wonder how you see that. But then where do you see kind of the wedge for change and the opening for change? And I know you've said that you would like to go back and help.
I'm going back.
You are going back, yes, okay. And I wonder how you think you can be effective and how that change will happen.
The first one, how popular really is Magufuli? If you want to measure the popularity of a president, I think the first thing you look at are opinion polls, right? Now, last year, somebody had the temerity to publish opinion polls, which showed that President Magufuli's approval rating had dropped from the high 80s to about 55%, which would still be very high by American standards, I guess.
These days, yes.
And what happened is this guy was basically stripped of his citizenship. His organization, his polling firm, has been put in a freezer somewhere. And immediately after, a law was rushed through Parliament. It is called the Statistics Act. And it says, if you want to collect any statistics on anything, you had better get permission from the government or its bureaucrats. 1. 2, if you publish your statistics and they tend to discredit or to question or to show fault with official statistics, then that is a criminal offense, and that will entitle you to a substantial jail term or a substantial fine or both. So for all intents and purposes, the only statistics today, the only opinion polls that you can get from Tanzania on how popular the president is would be polls from official government agencies. Everybody else is in danger of being declared a criminal if they dare do so. That is number one. Second, for a president who is that popular, as we are told, why this violence? Why would you want to shut down the press? Why would you want to destroy the opposition? Why would you want to make sure that everybody toes the party line? What is the basis of this fear if you are that popular? We are told, and they say it a lot, that the president has been very strong in fighting corruption. Let's look at the facts. You have to be wary of because I can talk on and on and on. Okay. The point is this. In the 3 years of President Magufuli's administration, we have seen hundreds of people detained and charged in courts and charged with these very serious economic offenses, corruption, money laundering, you name it. Hundreds. And last week, a former minister told me, brother, there are hundreds of business people who have been detained quietly, charged with money laundering, their accounts not seized, not frozen, but forfeited without a court order. So if they want your money, they charge you with money laundering or with this or that economic offense. They hold your account, they empty your account of any money there is, and in those 3 years, in spite of these hundreds of people who have been detained and charged with economic offenses, there isn't a single case that is being prosecuted, let alone a conviction. Not a single prosecution. Hundreds are in detention. These offenses are not bailable by our law. So they arrest people, charge them with economic crimes. They cannot get bail. They rot in prison. They rob them of their money. And the police don't investigate. And therefore, there is no conviction. Not a single conviction. One. Two, in some of the biggest scandals which were investigated by Parliament, by the last Parliament, which I was a member as well, and in which we showed how these people, Magufuli being a minister in the government, had basically helped themselves to the treasury, involving hundreds of millions of dollars, not a single one. And we named, names were named of very high people. Not a single one of them has been arrested or charged. And only this past week, on Friday last week actually, the Parliament Public Accounts Committee released a report which shows that in the past year alone, about $2 billion have gone missing within the government system. And half of it has gone down under the black hole called the President's office. So, all these claims about fighting corruption and what, and popularity and so on and so forth, I think they're just a cover for something else. They were used as a cover to destroy the opposition.